is entitled Turning a Blind Eye to Iran's Call for Genocide, the Legacy of Jihad and Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran. Andy and I were originally introduced electronically by a very good friend of ours, Judy Hirshon. And we quickly ended up debating Islam versus Islamism, and the debate still goes on, but through that debate we became good friends and respected colleagues, and I'm very grateful for Judy for introducing us, and this event has been a long time coming. Andy is not only one of the most preeminent scholars in Islamic theology, Islamic history, as well as the current fascist, Islamist, genocidal, totalitarian regimes. He's also one of my best defenders on Twitter. He is the author of several manuscripts and books, including The Legacy of Jihad, Islamic Holy War, as well as this book, which is beautiful, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism. And of course, his new book, Iran's Final Solution for Israel, The Legacy of Jihad and Shiite Islamic Jew Hatred in Iran, which I think is what the lecture is going to be based off today. And he was kind enough to provide for everybody a free copy of his book, so we're very grateful for that. Now, I wanted to comment because today, specifically, I think this topic is quite relevant because it was just announced by the Obama administration through, I think it was the New York Times this morning, that a compromise is now going to be met and is currently being discussed with Iran, where Iran can keep enriching its uranium. As well, they are allowed to keep all 10,000 of their centrifuges. Now, I looked up the definition of compromise in the dictionary because I wasn't sure if I, for some reason with pregnancy brain, forgot the meaning of the term. But I don't understand what we're getting for this compromise. In fact, I don't really understand why there is a pressure to reverse the decade-long attempt to limit the ability of the Iranians to manufacture nuclear arms. I don't understand when our sanctions were working and Tehran came to us hat in hand, what was the pressure that we had to start engaging in negotiations with them, and what are we getting from these negotiations except our own administration engaging in deceitful rhetoric, trying to convince us that everything's going to be okay. I mean, even Alan Dershowitz, who is one of the administration's staunch supporters, who assured us twice while he was lobbying for, well, not lobbying, but advocating for Obama's election and the re-election, he assured us that Obama was serious about limiting Iran's nuclear capability. And just the other day, Dershowitz came out with an article saying that he's not so sure anymore, and it's something that we've known for quite some time. You know, nothing really makes sense in terms of what the administration is pushing with these Iranian negotiations. The sanctions were working. So why did we decide to grant this genocidal regime the ability to continue enrich uranium? So perhaps this is something that Andy can clear up for us today. He's going to talk about why we've been pursuing this type of ineffective diplomacy and what can be done about it, as well as the history of the Islamist genocidal intentions and why we should no longer turn a blind eye to this, and our responsibility vis-a-vis educating people as to the true fascist genocidal nature of this regime, as well as Islamism in general. So just a couple housekeeping items. The admission fee today is $10. It goes to cover solely the cost of the event, and Ben, if he hasn't come around already, he will be coming around to collect. And also we have our book, Lawfare, The War Against Free Speech, for sale today for $10. Again, all proceeds go directly to the Lawfare project. And so without further delay, Andy.
Thanks, Brooke. Brooke gave me permission, my sister's here, and she can attest to this, and I guess this is being recorded too. so that my wife doesn't yell at me for not wearing a jacket. It's a little warm in the room. I prefer not to wear a jacket, and I was given. I just want to make it for the record. I was in fact given permission. Let's see.
Try to point to the projector.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, too far. Okay. So the process that's underway that Brooke was outlining is something called the P5+1 process. And it's really turned out, as she was suggesting, it's turned out into a complete fiasco. But basically, to define it, it's the P5 are the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council after World War II. So the United States, former Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain. The +1 is Germany. The party they're negotiating with is, of course, Iran. The original agreement, which would essentially enshrine Iran's right to enrich uranium under controlled circumstances, was signed November 24th, 2013. There was supposed to be a final agreement, which was reached this past July. Of course, that didn't happen. The negotiations were delayed through November 24th of 2014. Now there's been another extension through, ostensibly through at least June 30th. So those are the dates. But as Brooke was alluding to, there are what I would just say intractable flaws in the negotiations. There's no coverage of the ballistic missile program. There's no inspections of what we know to be military technical facilities. For example, at Parchin, where the International Atomic Energy Agency has documented that Iran has experimented with nuclear warhead development, not a minor issue. And even the so-called linchpin advance, Brooke is just updating me right now about this ability to maintain 10,000 centrifuges. Well, over the past year or so that this process has been going on, slightly more than a year now since the announcement, Iran has developed another generation of centrifuges. So the 10,000 that they'll be allowed to keep online from the previous 20,000 may, in fact, allow them to enrich just as much uranium as they've been enriching. And I want to show you a wonderful slide by Fred Fleitz, which demonstrates exactly how the enrichment has literally skyrocketed over the last since 2009. But more to illustrate the point about ballistic missiles, this is a missile, a 27-meter-long missile that is not even designed to destroy the little Satan Israel. This is designed for us. This is an intercontinental ballistic missile, and you can see it was on a launch pad close to Tehran, and this was demonstrated on an Israeli TV special, and it was based on a satellite image. Now, right before the agreement was announced, the extension of the agreement was announced this past November, the IAEA released a 104-page report, and it was very gloomy. It was surprisingly frank and gloomy. And what it concluded was that Iran was continuing to engage in what it called systematic, vigorous, combined military and dual military-civilian efforts, such as enrichment. Now, that's supposed to be the linchpin thing that at least we're stopping that. Weaponization, warhead and delivery system at some stage, and of course the ultimate goal was weaponization. There were no serious indications that Iran had stopped or abandoned this project or had intended to do so. On the contrary, Iran has resorted to further secrecy and concealment to keep its program intact and unhindered. Additional discoveries and data all underscore how a military program and military-related activities remain at the heart of Iran's nuclear program, and yet the process continues apace. This is the slide I was alluding to. It shows how enrichment has burgeoned. I mean, it's on a steep slope upward since 2009. And Fleitz's calculations and actually the confirmation by the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler, actually found that Fred's calculations were conservative. He went to the Harvard School, the Kennedy School, and interviewed Ali Heinonen, who certainly would lean to the left of Fred. And Kessler wrote the following about Heinenen's reaction about this slide. This graph should say that material available, red, is UF6, so that's the hexafluoride. of uranium, which can be used as such for further enrichment. Hyndman said, quote, "The rest, blue minus red, about 4 tons uranium in various chemical forms, can be reconverted to UF6. If converted, the number of bombs would be higher." I mean, so if anything, the estimate that Fred was making, where it cuts off on the green line, may be as high as the upper line there. So this is coming, of course, from the Kennedy School, not from the evil Center for Security Policy. Why? So Brooke asked this question, and I think that here we really have to take pause, because I think there's been a failure across the political spectrum. In the book, I refer to something as the trusting Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, trusting Khamenei, his successor, syndrome, and it's really based upon an incredibly insane op-ed that appeared in the New York Times in 1979 by the very odious Richard Falk. Many of you may know the name. He specializes in the international campaign to delegitimize Israel through the United Nations and sanctions and things like that. But he wrote an insane piece called Trusting Khomeini. It was literally called that. And basically the argument was that, what do you mean? This is a completely rational fellow. The idea that he's a medieval obscurantist? That's ridiculous. The idea that he practices dissimulation, or that he wants the Sharia to return to certain norms of the Safavid era, etc. I mean, that's just preposterous. He's going to usher in a new reformist Islamic renaissance. You're all crazy. And he's not the least bit bellicose. So that was the crux of his absurd piece. He was very specific. You know, there's not going to be a problem for non-Muslim minorities. There's not going to be a problem for the large communist left in Iran. All of which, you know, turned out to be horribly wrong. And also, Robert Baer, the former CIA analyst, published his book in 2008, The Devil We Know, and he basically calls Iran it's changed since 1979. It's now a reasonable hegemon seeking justice, and the justice I think he's alluding to is the whole notion that you know, the CIA and the Brits engineered the coup against Mossadegh, and there's a lot of sort of post-colonial resentment about that, but I guess that's their legitimate grievance. But there is an alternative view that is very disconcerting to me as an openly political conservative, and that's what I call the trusting Montazeri-Musavi green movement syndrome. Because if you study these ideologues, Montazeri being the religious ideologue, Musavi being the political representative, you will see that in the end their ideology is absolutely no different than Khomeini's, and even their policy recommendations. Finally, I think there's been a clear rejection of what I will show, I will argue is the only short-term and maybe even long-term solution, and that's from a wonderful book. I actually brought it with me, so I'll hold it up. This is Matt Kroenig's book. I would recommend that everyone get. It's just a lucid analysis as to why, from the perspective of a mainstream Council on Foreign Relations, Georgetown University associate professor, there's only a military option at this point. It's an outstanding book, and I hope Matt gets out more in public. He's a very good speaker.
What's the title?
I'm sorry, it's called A Time to Attack.
And what's the author's name?
Matthew Kroenig, K-R-O-E-N-I-G. Georgetown University. Unbelievable that he survives in that environment. So what are Iran's motivational pillars? And this is what will be the crux of my talk. I would say there are 3 things, 2 of which are pretty straightforward, you've probably heard about. Certainly jihad, conquering warfare, institutionalized warfare, and this is shared by Sunni and Shiite Islam alike. Something that you haven't heard of, probably, or some of you might have. This is the idea of najis, or infidel impurity. And it is a form of religiously inspired hatred of non-Muslims that has to do with their spiritual and physical impurity, and I'll get into that a bit. And then, of course, what's perhaps most misunderstood, even though it's recognized in some way or shape or form, is the canonical Islamic Jew hatred that comes right out of Islam's core text. And by that I'm talking about the Quran, the Hadith, these collections of the traditions of Muhammad as put together by his earliest followers, almost like a Muslim gospel, if you wish. And then these early pious Muslim biographies of Muhammad. So the Hadith and the biographies together form something called the Sunnah. And then there's also elements of the Hadith which introduce end of times theology, and I'll touch on that a bit. And if I were to classify 4 major clarifications I'd like to make, the first one is very important. Really what you saw happen in 1979 was not some sort of sui generis phenomenon. Iran was being reconnected to its past, to its Safavid Qajar theocratic past, which was essentially the period from 1501 to 1925. Now there's a period of internecine turmoil and struggle in the 18th century. That's part of that period. There was some heterodox experimentation with a variant of Shiite Islam that was much closer to Sunni Islam under Nadir Shah. But basically, that we're talking about the whole period. When the Qajar dynasty is reestablished in 1795, it's basically a continuation of what had been the Safavid period from 1501 to about 1720. So basically, if you look at that period en bloc, Brown, who was a Persianophilic scholar of literature, really, but also an historian, and spent time in Iran, he wrote in 1906 about this combined period of the Qajar and Safavid dynasties. Quote, the mujtahids, these are very learned jurists and scholars, and the mullah, more garden variety preachers, are a great force in Persia and concern themselves with every department of human activity, from the minutest detail of personal purification to the largest issues of politics. Well, that's exactly what we see today. Iran's current attitudes towards Israel also mirror its treatment of Iranian Jewry during the Safavid Qajar eras. The Green Movement ideologues, unfortunately, and politicians share the Ayatollah Khamenei worldviews, and there's overwhelming support to this day for a Sharia state and a nuclear program, which also, unfortunately, persists in Iran. Now, if we want to see how closely linked the ideologies of Khomeini, representing the current traditionalist regime, and Montazeri, the alleged spiritual inspiration of the Green Movement, how compatible they are, how inseparable they are. Just look at their views on Muhammad as the prototype for global jihadism. From Khomeini, Islam grew with blood. The great prophet of Islam in one hand carried the Quran, and in the other a sword, the sword for crushing the traitors and the Quran for guidance. Islam is a religion of blood for the infidels, but a religion of guidance for other people. Since the Jews of Banu Qurayza, it's a very important motif in Islam, were a troublesome group, causing corruption in Muslim society and damaging Islam and the Islamic State, the most noble messenger eliminated them. And now his alleged antithesis, Ayatollah Montazeri, the Jews of Medina at the time of the noble prophet sided with the infidels against Islam and Muslims. He, Muhammad, did not sit in a corner and merely pray, although all his prayers would have been answered. On the contrary, he carried out an uprising and had about 80 military clashes. He called on the Muslims to arise, and he established and powerfully implemented Allah's laws among the people. They are being honest about the notion about where the human inspiration for jihad comes from, and it comes from Muhammad himself, who in the canonical hadith sanctioned jihad terror, sanctioned jihad martyrdom, and even foreshadowed the conquest of Byzantium and Persia. So they are just acknowledging what is in the canonical texts. Now, jihad in the Shiite, Safavid, and Qajar theocracies, I wanted to clarify some things about that. It essentially evolved to be a doctrine that was indistinguishable from its Sunni counterpart by the late 13th century. And that means open-ended warfare against non-Muslims. This idea that you may have even heard about, that they're sort of passively waiting for the 12th Imam before they can wage jihad, was argued away almost a millennium ago. I don't know why that persists, but it does. Full implementation allowed the Safavids actually to create their empire, and the Qajars to maintain it as they could. And ultimately, the notion was that, in fact, it's more honorable to wage jihad in the absence of the 12th Imam. And in terms of just boilerplate, to show how it evolved to essentially the same doctrine as the Sunni. I quote here Al-Amili, who was an important jurist during Shah Abbas I's reign, so that's during the Safavid period. Jihad against followers of other religions, such as Jews, is required unless they convert to Islam or pay the jizya, the poll tax, that's per Quran 929. I document in the book a period under the longest reigning Safavid Shah, Shah Tahmasp, who was the son of the founder of the Safavid dynasty, Shah Ismail. And this was a series of jihad campaigns waged against Christian Georgia, and it's punctuated by the monotonous ugliness of what you will see in jihad campaigns, over a millennium: massacre, pillage, enslavement, and deportation. Since my wife and I were forced to do so much memorization as part of medical school, and you've probably heard of mnemonic devices, I came up with a simple one for jihad war, which was MPED: massacre, pillage, enslavement, and deportation. And so consistent with this doctrine also was the fact that you may have heard of this notion of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, the abode of war, the abode of Islam. Well, in the Dar al-Harb, lands that have not yet been conquered by the Muslim armies and that actually have refused to submit peacefully, the lives and property of its inhabitants are licit. And to get more specific about this, the jurists, not just Shiite, but I'm giving you an example of Shiite jurists, sanction the killing of non-combatants openly. And we can see this amongst the Shia as well. These are important jurists that I cite here. But also, again, you'll see that the 18th century jurist Ali Tabatabai invoked Muhammad's campaigns against another Jewish tribe in Medina, the Banu Nadir, and his sieges to justify such actions. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. This is the notion that may be very unfamiliar to you, and it's very ugly. And so I will cite the man who was literally the Ayatollah Khomeini of his era, Majlisi, who died in 1699. He happened to be in position of power at the end of the reign of Shah Suleiman and the beginning of the reign of Shah Hussein. So for a 6-year period between the end of the first and the beginning of the second Shah, so between Suleiman and Hussein, he was literally the de facto leader of Iran, in the dotage of one and in the infancy and childhood of the other. And so again, he did acquire the recognition as being the Khomeini of his era. And he writes this, I mean, it sounds lovely, oceans of light, I mean, the New Age. And when you look through it, and it's a massive work, it's 20, 30 volumes, he clarifies two aspects of the non-Muslims' najis. The first concerns spiritual impurity, which is, as my translator recorded it, their essential nastiness and corruption of their beliefs. And the second flows logically from the first, and it's juridical. But it's about their concrete physical impurity and the restrictions that are going to have to be imposed on them because of this. He also elaborated more about this in something called lightning bolts against the Jews. Now, it does sound pretty bad, but it's actually more general. It's not just about the Jews, but there is sort of, you get the flavor of this obsession over the Jews. And Lawrence Loeb, who's actually, I believe, a cantor, but also an anthropology professor from the University of Utah, did his doctoral work in southern Iran, and he commented, almost understatedly, that fear of pollution by Jews led to great excesses and peculiar behavior by Muslims. But far worse are the pogroms and massacres and rendering areas Judenrein that this could result in. Now, in Majlisi's treatise, Lightning Bolts Against the Jews, he goes through the blood ransom poll tax that's related to Quran 929, and then he enumerates 6 other restrictions that relate to worship, housing, dress, transportation, and weapons. In other words, dhimmis are not, those subjected are not allowed to carry weapons. But that's very boilerplate, actually. I mean, this is similar between Sunni and Shiite. It's, I'd say, identical. But where he gets off differently is the najis regulations. Quote, "It would also be better if the ruler of the Muslims would establish that all infidels could not move out of their houses on days when it rains or snows, because they would make Muslims impure." And you can see chronicles through even into just the beginning of the Pahlavi period. So the very beginning after the Pahlavis end the theocracy, that you still see accounts of Jews being beaten, sometimes very severely, for having gone out in the rain. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because, again, it's very misunderstood. I'm at a loss as to why there remains controversy about this, but I would be dishonest if I denied that it remains. So I just want to give you an example of where canonical Islamic Jew hatred comes from, and some of the shared motifs from the Quran, the Hadith, and the biographies of Muhammad. And I'll touch very briefly on one interesting theme which comes up in the culpability of the Jews for the Sunni Shiite carnage even to this day that we see going on. And I'll mention that. It has to do with a figure, whether he's truly historical or not, Abdullah ibn Saba. I want to give you an example of some of the restrictive codes that were imposed upon the Jews as a result of these Najis regulations and applied throughout the Safavid and Qadr periods. And then some of this material through historical overview and eyewitness accounts. So this isn't the terrible Islamophobe Bostom. This is a mainstream Islamologist, Camilla Adan, and she lays it out very openly in this 1999 characterization. Islamic polemics against Judaism and its adherents is a phenomenon as old as Islam itself, and the Quran is its very first source. Now, what I did in the large tome that is Brooks' gift is I translated a seminal work by the late Grand Imam Tantawi. Tantawi was the Grand Imam from 1996 to March 2010, when he died of a heart attack. And his ticket to fame in the Muslim orbit was a 700-page magnum opus, which translates in English as The Children of Israel in the Quran and the Sunnah. And I've taken a very representative summary extract from that and presented it here so that maybe it helps one appreciate the problem we're dealing with. This is what the papal equivalent in Sunni Islam wrote in this magnum opus. The Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, i.e. killing the prophets of Allah, a recurrent theme. So, for example, at verses, when you see something like 261, that's the second surah or chapter, the 61st verse, and that's how I'll say these things throughout. 3:112, it's repeated, more than those two places, but those are two examples. Corrupting his words, Allah's words, by putting them in the wrong places, consuming the people's wealth frivolously, refusal to distance themselves from the evil they do, and other ugly characteristics caused by their deep-rooted lasciviousness. Only a minority of the Jews keep their word. All Jews are not the same. The good ones become Muslims, and this is actually Quran 3:113. The bad ones do not. And there's depressingly copious evidence of this, and if you'll bear with me, I really think it merits a little bit of time, and I want to just read to you some summary information that I put together in the book that you have before you. So the crux of the Quranic polemics against Judaism, to paraphrase Adan, is a central anti-Semitic motif in the Quran, which decrees an eternal curse upon the Jews. That's Quran 261, reiterated at 290, 3:112, and elsewhere, for slaying the prophets and transgressing against the will of Allah. It should be noted that Quran 3:112 is featured before the preamble to Hamas's foundational covenant. It's literally the first words in the covenant, before you get to the discussion about the linkage to the Muslim Brotherhood. This central motif is coupled to Quranic verses 560 and 578, which describe the Jews' transformation into apes and swine. That's Quran 560. Or simply apes. That happens twice, 265, 7:166. Having been, quote, cursed by the tongue of David and Jesus, Mary's son. That's verse 578. Muhammad himself repeats the Quranic curse in a canonical hadith, and he just literally recites Quran 578. The related verse, Quran 564, accuses the Jews of being, quote, spreaders of war and corruption, a sort of ancient Quranic antecedent of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a verse invoked not only by Hezbollah leaders Fadlallah and Nasrallah, Fadlallah being the spiritual founder who passed away not too long ago, Nasrallah, who is unfortunately still with us, but moderate Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas cited Quran 564 during a January 2007 speech which urged Palestinian Muslims to end their internecine strife and aim their rifles at Israel. Indeed, the Quran's overall discussion of the Jews is marked by a litany of their sins and punishments as if part of a divine indictment, conviction, and punishment process. Two examples of Quranic litanies were compiled independently and from very different perspectives by Middle East historian Saul Friedman and the contemporary Al-Azhar University theologian Atiya Sakar. And so Saul Friedman went through a whole listing of things. It's almost too long to enumerate. And this was in 1971. These are all Quranic verses describing odious characteristics and qualities of the Jews. March 22nd, 2004, so a little over 30 years later, Sakar, who was the head of the Al-Azhar Fatwa Committee, Al-Azhar University is the seat of Sunni religious education and has been so for about, it was originally founded by a minority sect, the Fatimids, but by the Mamluk period, so middle 13th century onward, it's really the preeminent teaching institution for Sunni Islam. So Sakar comes up he gets a question online. What, according to the Quran, are the Jews' main characteristics and qualities? And he goes through 20 negative characteristics and puts them up online for all to see. Now, in the large compendium, The Legacy of Islamic Anti-Semitism, there was actually a beautiful essay by an Israeli scholar that was published in 1988 that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. I reproduced it in there for, I hope, more general reading. And it's by Hagi Ben Shammai, and it's called Jew Hatred in the Islamic Tradition and Exegesis. And I really suggest, I have some extracts from it in the book, but basically he goes through how these verses are interrelated. And one of the things he points out is from the opening surah of the Quran. So the Quran, basically, the reason why it's very difficult for people to get into, and it seems so disjointed, is because it doesn't have the chronology of the Old Testament, of the New Testament. The chapters of surahs 2 to 114, there's 114 total, are literally longest to shortest. The opening surah was sort of spatchcocked on afterward. It's very short, and it's only got 7 short verses. The 7th verse talks about and the opening surah is supposed to be recited 17 times a day. If you count up not only the 5 prayer times, but the units of prayer that are broken up. They're called rakas. But the 7th verse talks about not following the straight path, but not following the path of those who have been cursed or who have engendered Allah's anger or have gone astray. And those who have engendered Allah's anger are the Jews, and those who've gone astray are the Christians. And there's some cross-pollination between those two designations. But essentially, if you look at 1,300 years of exegesis, of gloss on this verse, that's exactly what Muslims are taught to interpret. And so what Ben Shammai says, this verse is in turn, so he's talking about 1:7, linked to Quranic verses 560 and 578, which I mentioned earlier, which describe the Jews' transformation into apes and swine, 560, having been cursed by the tongue of Jesus and David, 578. Ben Shammai explains the primary reason for this fearful decree, which resulted in the Jews being so terribly cursed. And here's what he says in this academic treatment from 1988. From the time immemorial, the Jews rejected God's sign, the wonders performed by the prophets. They did not accept the prophecy of Jesus, whom the Quran counts among the prophets, although it's a very different Jesus. But this is all part of the Jews' nature. They are by their very nature deceitful and treacherous. So this is the Quranic revelation about the Jews. And I don't understand to this day why there's a lot of denial still about the content of the Quran vis-a-vis the Jews. It's baffling. Oops, that one. Let's move on to another canonical source, the Hadith and the biographies of Muhammad. So you've heard about this motif now in the Quran. I've mentioned about prophet killing. Well, this is actually updated in the Hadith to include the poisoning, the literal poisoning of Muhammad. And it actually became part of the Iranian teachers' training college exam. Question: students given a multiple choice question in order to identify the instigator of the martyrdom of Muhammad, the correct answer being a Jewess. So you could get credit towards your teacher's exam certification. Worse than that, I would say, really, is that this is universally taught to Muslim children in madrasas and religious schools, including those within Western societies. Brooke, I saw this was taught in a Canadian Muslim school, this motif of the Jews as poisoners of Muhammad. If we look more proudly at the tradition of warfare waged by Muhammad, and it's reproduced very distinctively and with emphasis in the Hadith and in the biographies, again, it's replete with my mnemonic: massacre, pillage, enslavement, and deportation. And when it's directed at the Jews, it's because of their alleged stubborn malevolence. Muhammad claims he is made victorious through terror and orders political assassinations and torture murders of Jewish leaders, and they're very graphically described. I mentioned this Quranic motif of the Jews as apes and pigs. Muhammad himself invokes that. Before he slaughters the Banu Qurayza, he personally beheads them. After the Khaybar Jews are subjugated, including slaughter, he imposes upon them this sort of nascent Sharia-based order, and they're complaining about one of the forms of taxation, according to the Muslim historian Baladuri, and then he says, "You're worse than apes and pigs." So these motifs are coming directly from Muhammad, and that's why they're so important, and that's why we really can't afford to ignore them. And then, of course, you probably have heard about how, particularly in Sunni eschatology, it turns out. Here's one area where the Shiites may be better. That the Jews the annihilation of the Jews is central to the ushering in of the Messianic age. The Jews are associated with this Antichrist-like figure who is always accompanied by Jews and alternately actually identified as being Jewish, the Dajjal, the Dijjal. The Shiites, basically mainstream Shiite eschatology, end of times theology, because it's a lot of it is a back and forth polemic with the Sunnis. The Sunnis replace the Jews. In other words, the Jews are forcibly converted, but it's the Sunnis that are slaughtered en masse. Now, because there's cross-pollination, some of particularly in our age, there's some, the canonical hadith that's in the about the Garkad tree that's in the Hamas charter that Haj Amin al-Husani used to cite, which is central to Sunni eschatology and the Jews having to be annihilated. You see some cross-pollination with that in the Shiite literature as well. But I did want to summarize just one other thing for you from the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism, which I also included in the Iran book, so you can see it there. George Vaida, who was a Hungarian rabbi who spent a lot of time doing research and training in France, wrote a magisterial essay in 1937 that will never be matched. It translates. It was written in French. It translates Jews and Muslims according to the Hadith. It's a 70-page essay with 202 references. It's the most definitive work on mining through this material, much of which is very unpleasant. And here's his sort of summary assessment. And I think, it's going to be definitive. I don't think it's going to be equaled. And I was very privileged, I thought, to be the first person to translate it into English in my book. I don't know why it sat out there for 70 years, but so be it. In the everyday corporeal world, Vaida observes, quote, distrust must reign, unquote, in Muslims' relations with Jews because, he says, the Jews are rebels to the solicitations of Islam and keep their religious tradition in a way liable to lead Muslims into error. Even when Islam knowingly borrows from Judaism, these borrowings are presented as amendments of the corresponding Jewish customs. And then he goes on to say, Jews are represented in the darkest colors in the Hadith. Convinced by the clear testimony of their books that Muhammad was the true prophet, they refuse to convert out of envy, jealousy, and national particularism, even out of private interest. They have falsified their sacred books and do not apply the laws of Allah. Nevertheless, they pursued Muhammad with their raillery and their oaths, and harassed him with questions, an enterprise that turned to their own confusion and merely corroborated the authenticity of the supernatural science of the prophet. From words they moved to action. Sorcery, poisoning, assassination held no scruples for them. And therefore they have to be subjected in this manner that's quite humiliating, the so-called dhimmi condition. And this is not, again, this is coming from the most authoritative analysis by a Jewish scholar that's ever been conducted on this material. So again, I found it baffling when this was so poorly known and so people were so reluctant to appreciate its relevance and its lasting significance. So one last theme that goes beyond the period historically of the Hadith and the Sirah is from the early, particularly the Sunni Muslim histories, but then the Shia picked up on it too, actually I think to defend themselves. And this is about Abdullah ibn Saba, the black Yemenite Jew, and he's identified as son of a black woman. And so it's got actually racist as well as anti-Semitic overtones. And again, it's still one of these things that's taught to Muslim students in the diaspora, if we want to call it that, and certainly in Islamic countries. So basically he's accused by Sunnis of fomenting what is this breach in Islam's political innocence, the rightly guided caliph period. So it would be around the time of the third and fourth caliphs, and literally advancing Shiism himself. And this was chronicled by Tabari, who was an important Muslim historian and polymath, wrote a massive Quranic commentary. And it's taught by Al-Azhar University, and it's in contemporary textbooks for Sunni Muslim students. I was very interested, particularly for the Iran book, how do the Shiites deal with this? I mean, they're being accused of being the terrible fruit of the Jews, basically. And so they've come up with their own, whatever you want to call it, apologetic for this. And they recognize who he is. He is a black Jew, but he introduced heresies into Shiism, and ultimately Ali had him burned for his heresies. So that's how they tend to deal with it. And it has come up again recently, since the horrible civil war in Syria, as being, once again, particularly the Sunnis will accuse the Jews of being responsible for the carnage that's going on in the Middle East, and the Shiites will do the same thing. And you'll see, occasionally you'll actually even see invocations of Abdullah ibn Saba. So now you may recognize that if that comes up in memory or something like that. I wanted to show you what the Sharia and the Najis regulations laid out actually looked like from Al-Amili, who's a very important jurist. And these things persisted again until the Pahlavi period, the Shah's modern period in between 1925 and 1979. Jews are not permitted to dress like Muslims. A Jew must exhibit a yellow or red badge of dishonor on his chest. A Jew is not permitted to ride on a horse. When riding on an ass, he must hang both legs on one side. He is not entitled to bear arms. On the street and in the market, he must pass stealthily from a corner or from the side. Jewish women are not permitted to cover their faces because they're considered often to just be prostitutes. Why do they have to cover their faces? The Jew is restricted from establishing boundaries of private property. A Jew who becomes a Muslim is forbidden to return to Judaism. And actually that had a tremendous impact on the Jewish community in terms of inheritance. So one could convert to Islam and then take the entire family fortune with them. Upon disclosure of a disagreement between Jew and Muslim, the Jew's argument has no merit. In Muslim cities, the Jew is forbidden to build a synagogue. A Jew is not entitled to have his house built higher than a Muslim's. So that's the law. But as Yogi Berra said, in discussing theory and practice, he said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. Now, unfortunately, unfortunately, that's true. There were breaches of this. I mean, people can't enforce this kind of lunacy on an absolutely continual basis. But it did have its impact. And that's why it's very interesting to read the travelogue accounts about how consistently, in fact, it was applied. Not universally in every location in every epoch, but with a grinding regularity. And this is from Israel Joseph Benjamin's chronicle around the mid-19th century. He traveled across the Islamic world, including into Persia. And here's what he wrote, again around mid-19th century. Throughout Persia, the Jews are obliged to live in a part of town separated from the other inhabitants. They are considered as unclean creatures. Again, this idea of najis, who bring contamination with their intercourse and presence. Even in the streets of their own quarter of the town, they are not allowed to keep open any shop. They may only sell their spices and drugs, or carry on the trade of a jeweler in which they have attained great perfection. Under the pretext of their being unclean, they are treated with the greatest severity, and should they enter a street inhabited by Muslims, they are pelted by the boys and the mobs with stones and dirt. For the same reason, they are forbidden to go out when it rains. Again, he's noticing this. For it is said that the rain would wash dirt off them, which would sully the feet of the Muslims. And then he goes on to talk about an interesting phenomenon which is related to the Ashura, that you might have seen, the self-flagellation ceremony. It's very important in Shiite Islam. It's mourning the death of Hussein.
And if I can interrupt you just to speak into the microphone as much as you can.
I'm sorry.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry. And this was a time of terrible insecurity for Jews, and I saw this even in Faraday Golden's chronicle about her coming of age in the 1960s and 1970s in the Shiraz ghetto, that they would not go out during the Ashura period because they could be attacked and killed. And so this is noticed by a chronicler a century earlier. And I just found that fascinating, and I will get to some of her observations because she's now a professor at Old Dominion University, and she had some incredible insights of the period that led to the transition between the Pahlavis and Khomeini's reinstatement of the Sharia. But in terms of the Qadr period, no one matches the work of Walter Fischl to this day. There are some newer treatments. They still don't get to what he got to in his wisdom and his clarity. And I found this absolutely fascinating. That he comments that the image of Iranian Jews among Iranian Muslims as sorcerers and practitioners of black magic. This was something I was only familiar with from medieval Christianity. He said, was as deeply embedded in the minds of the masses as it had been in medieval Europe. The consequences of these bigoted superstitions were predictable. This is Fischl again. It was therefore easy to arouse there, the Muslim masses, fears and suspicions at the slightest provocation, and to accuse them, the Jews, of possessing Kabbalistic Hebrew writings, amulets, talismans, which they, the Jews, were using against the Islamic authorities. So this is a very, very dark and conspiratorial kind of attitude. And of course he goes on in his own way to describe the impact of these impurity regulations, including pogroms and forced conversions throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And he also notices this period where Majlisi would have held sway, so between Shah Suleiman and Shah Hussein. And he talks about day-by-day accounts of eyewitnesses established beyond doubt how the notion of the ritual uncleanliness of the non-Muslims raged wildly all over the country, affecting Christians and Jews alike, and how the times of Shah Abbas II, that was a little bit earlier than this period, seemed to have been revived, and that was a particularly bad period for the Jews as well. And then he goes on to interconnect the Safavid and Qajar dynasties. He says, since the religious and political foundations of the Qajar dynasty, again, so this is what evolves after 1795, were but a continuation of those of the Safavids, the law of apostasy and the notion of the ritual uncleanliness of the Jews remained the basis of the attitude toward the Jews. The Jew, being ritually unclean, had to be differentiated from the believer externally in every possible way. This became the decisive factor, making the life of the Jews in the 19th century an uninterrupted sequence of persecution and oppression. He also goes on to use a word I had never seen outside of a European context, which is Judenrein. Now you have to remember, on the one hand, he is talking about much smaller massacres. On the other hand, he's talking about much smaller populations. There was never a period of time when the Jews of Persia amounted to any more than 0.4% of the population. So it struck me as you had to have quite a serious animus to be willing to go after a population that small. And then, of course, there was the phenomenon of crypto-Judaism in Iran and the forced conversion of the Jews of Meshed. He also goes on to talk about how there were attempts, particularly with the establishment of the Alliance Israelite Universelle, to improve the condition of the Jews. And there was also an incredibly noble Austrian physician, Joseph Pollack. I included an extract in the updated preface of the book about Pollack's work. He went to work for Shah Nasser ad-Din and helped establish medical training in Persia and tried to intercede on behalf of the Persian Jews because he was, for some point, the personal physician to the Shah. And unfortunately, though, Fischel concludes, the intervention of European Jewry in favor of their Persian brothers did not bring about the hoped-for improvement and scarcely lessened the persecution and suffering of the Jews after the return of the Shah from Europe. So this was the end of the 19th century. So there was an attempt at intervention. Okay. I'll skip over some stuff because I think you're getting the point. There were confirmatory accounts from U.S. consuls about what Fischel was describing. I think that's important, but you can look at that in the book. There was also a very interesting account by Claude Annette. That's a nom de plume. He was Jean Chauffeur. He was one of the first French tennis Open champions in the late 1890s. He traveled literally in that book. It's through Persia in a motor car, and he confirmed even into the era where there were these constitutional reforms in the first century of the first decade of the 20th century that the situation really had not changed for the Jews of Persia. Okay. This is actually very important. And again, just to show you that the notion of jihad has come back full force in the contemporary Iranian theocracy, and it's no different. I skipped what Khomeini said. You can imagine what Khomeini said. I don't have to tell you. He wrote something called it actually in 1942. Islam is not a religion of pacifists. Suffice you can extrapolate from the title. But this is what Montazeri said. The offensive jihad is a war that an imam wages in order to invite infidels and non-monotheists to Islam. And he goes on to quote Quran 8:39. This verse includes defensive as well as offensive jihad. Jihad, like prayer, is for all times and is not permitted limited to an early period of Islam. And then he goes on to talk about this idea, in the Mahdi's occultation period, jihad is not to be abandoned, even if occultation lasts for 100,000 years. So in other words, if the Mahdi stays in his well or wherever he went, keep going. Muslims have to defend and fight for the expansion of Islam. Certainly if in Islam the goodness was in the sword, in our time the goodness is in the artillery, tanks, automatic guns, and missiles. And just to point out from this quote that the idea of jihad as an ideological mission in God's way is literally enshrined in the Iranian constitution. Right after the initial P5+1 was announced, now we're talking about 2013, another one of the litany of so-called moderates who used to advise Muhammad Khatami, who was also, of course, a moderate, invoked the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is Muhammad's treaty, really armistice to give the Muslims a chance to regroup and defeat the pagans of Mecca. So that's how he viewed it as what the Iranians might be doing. And he's open about the fierce war with Americans on all levels. and of course, the Great War in the near term, at least, being the annihilation of Israel. This was literally announced. I think it was less than 3 weeks after the P5+1 negotiations came out. So Jihad being very much alive.
Oh wait, hold on a second. Where's? Never mind. Montazeri. I have to see the spelling.
Oh, Montazeri. And also, again, this is Ayatollah Montazeri. I want to emphasize, if I haven't done enough already, this is the spiritual godfather of the Green Movement. Elise Sanassarian is an expatriate Iranian and a political scientist at USC, and she's done some careful analyses of his work, as did the late Sarah Sarudi, who is an Iranian Jew and is a wonderful Israeli scholar. So this is from Sanassarian. Montazeri saw Najas in 12 items, including blood, dogs, pigs, wine, and kafirs, i.e. non-Muslims. A kafir's body, including hair, nails, and body fluids, was to be avoided. The purchase, sale, or receiving of meat and fat from either non-Muslim countries or a kafir were forbidden. But again, he's getting to the other notion, which is worse. I mean, it's hard to say exactly which is worse, but the spiritual impurity of non-Muslim kafirs as a political order from Islam and must be adhered to by the followers of Islam, and the goal was to promote general hatred toward those who are outside Muslim circles. This is not a voice of reason and moderation. The wrong way on this one? Okay. Okay.